Hello and welcome to the first video from The Answer. My name is Dr. Nick Gadsby. I'm the founder of The Answer, where I specialise in brand strategy and insight, using cultural analysis, semiotics and other cultural approaches like anthropology and metaphor analysis. So this is the first of 3 videos where I'm going to explain the post-binary trend and why it's so important for brands as we move into the 21st century. Now, you probably quite rightly might be wondering why the subject deserves 3 videos devoted to it. Well, the honest reason is that there is quite a lot to say on the subject of the post-binary trend in culture. And I originally tried to record it as one video, which didn't turn out quite as I expected. It ended up being almost 30 minutes long, which felt just a touch excessive. No matter how interesting a subject is, does anyone really have the time to sit down and watch a full 30-minute video? Probably not, to be fair. Each of the 3 videos will cover a broad theme around the post-binary trend. The first video will cover the basics. What do we actually mean by the post-binary world? The second video will cover why post-binary is so important for brands right now. And the third video will cover how you actually apply post-binary thinking to your brand. So, by the final video, hopefully you'll have a complete sense of what the post-binary trend is all about, and also have some thoughts about how you could use it for a brand. So the reason we decided to make this video was because following the session I did at the MRS Impact Conference back in March, where we briefly discussed post-binary culture, quite a few people were quite excited by the idea. A few people showed quite a lot of interest in it. But when I talked about the post-binary trend there, it was a fairly light touch explanation, as obviously it wasn't the main subject of the session. So it felt like this was a great opportunity to go into more depth about it and explain in more detail this quite frankly, big important trend that's going on. So the first question you probably have is, what on earth is the post-binary world? What is this trend? Which is a very good question. It's a surprisingly big, sweeping cultural trend that we picked up on a few years ago. It's what we call a meta-trend. That is, it's a trend that encompasses lots of smaller trends in different areas of culture and in different sectors and categories of products and services. Now, one of the great things about meta trends is that in a media fragmented world, they are relevant across numerous audiences. And this is also very true for the post-binary trend as well, as we'll see as we go through some of the examples. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. The short definition of what post-binary is that the world is becoming less defined by traditional binary oppositions, and is therefore becoming more post-binary. It's that simple. But let's get into the detail of what this actually looks like. Now, I'm guessing that when I say post-binary, the first thing that probably comes to mind is gender, which is a great place to start. It's a really great place to start. We're all familiar with this term. So we're all familiar with the term non-binary used in this context to describe people who don't identify as just male or female in terms of gender or sexuality. There are numerous new ways to define and talk about gender and sexuality that are going on in this space. Non-binary, gender fluidity, asexual, pansexual, and numerous other terms. So importantly, if we take male and female as a conventional binary concept of gender, we can see that gender has become a more fluid concept. There's a lot more going on than just female or male in the space of gender and sexuality. And this is a great example of how the post-binary works in culture. But gender is just one of the more, if not the most visible example of the post-binary. Beyond gender, basically, what we see in a post-binary world is that lots of things that used to be defined in a binary way, that is, in terms of either this or that, are now being redefined in terms of and also. In other words, things that we previously thought were entirely oppositional can now actually be credibly combined, mixed together, or united in some way to create something new, more relevant and more meaningful. Now, there are many things happening in culture that are examples of the post-binary without us actually realising it. An example of something that is pretty mainstream without us realising that it's actually post-binary is flexitarianism. According to a recent Euromonitor report, a remarkable 42% of global consumers are flexitarian, and a recent article in the Times suggested that 1 in 3 adults in the UK has gone flexitarian, as they put it in the paper. Now, in the binary world, in the old traditional binary world, it used to be that you were either a vegetarian or a meat eater. But in the post-binary world, with flexitarianism, an individual can be vegetarian and also a meat eater. Another example of a growing trend that is post-binary without us realising it is no or low alcoholic beverages, like Seedlip or Jukes or non-such, as well as all the alcohol-free variants of existing brands. So again, it used to be that you either drank or you were sober, but with no/low alcohol brands, you can now drink and also be sober. So these two examples show how, in post-binary culture, two things that would conventionally be in tension with each other can be combined to create something innovative. It shows that opposites don't just attract, but are a driving force in creating new trends in culture. So with post-binary culture, what is happening is a broad challenge to how things have been categorised in culture in the Western world for the last 300 years or so, that were all founded on distinct concepts like male versus female, or public versus private, or home versus work, or human versus technology. Now, like virtually all significant cultural trends, of course, it's not an entirely new concept. The foundations of post-binary culture have been around for a long time. It's particularly visible in the area of technology, for example, where breaking down binaries was, and continues to be, a key source of innovation. Think about inventions like the telegram, the telephone, the television, and even the internet. They were all defined in some sense by the idea of breaking down distance between people, so that either near or far away was transformed into near and also far away. And brands that use technology as a platform today continue to differentiate themselves in this way. For example, Airbnb is about being home and also away. Uber provides a service that is public and also private. Deliveroo is about eating out and also eating in. NFTs, they're unique and also infinitely reproducible. The pandemic has also acted as a catalyst for many of these trends. For example, the closure of workplaces for many meant that life used to be spent either at work or at home, whereas now many people are at work and also at home. So this kind of post-binary thinking is therefore at the vanguard of cultural and social change. Think of the concept of sustainable consumption, for example. In the old binary world, this would be a contradiction in terms. Consumption is, by definition, the process of using something up. But in the post-binary world, we are able to conceive how we can use something up and also sustain it for future generations. So what this shows is that the old binary opposition culture created all sorts of tensions because binaries create boundaries, and boundaries can easily become conflicts. Many of the problems we face today are consequences of society adhering to binary oppositions even when they don't make sense anymore. A timely example of how thinking in a binary way can have negative outcomes comes from the pandemic itself. In this case, the guilty party was the World Health Organization. The initial public health guidance supplied by the WHO focused on hand washing and social distancing to reduce transmission of the virus. And the reason for this was that the WHO believed that the main cause of transmission was via droplets. Now, droplet transmission tends to occur in close quarters, sort of within 1 metre distance of another person. It can also be picked up from surfaces, which was why hand washing was such an important part of the initial advice given to the public, along with social distancing. Now, while this advice wasn't wrong, it turned out to be insufficient. As we now know, COVID-19 is transmitted by both droplet transmission and also airborne transmission. Airborne transmission, by contrast with droplet transmission, can occur over much longer distances, and the droplets themselves can remain suspended in the air for much longer periods of time. So wearing a mask or a face covering in indoor public spaces greatly reduces the risk of transmission. Now, it took the WHO several months before they added this to their public health guidance, putting millions of lives at greater risk. And this was because they were thinking in a binary way. The WHO were locked into an either-or way of thinking. The basic error they made was that what counted as an aerosol for the purpose of transmission was limited to a certain size of globule, 5 microns or bigger for droplets, smaller than 5 microns for aerosols. So, for the WHO, a globule was either a droplet or an aerosol, but it couldn't be both. It took the efforts of numerous scientists to correct the WHO's error, and one of the key figures was Lindsay Marr, whose scientific expertise itself was post-binary. Lindsay's post-binary expertise was also largely marginalised by the mainstream scientific community because it didn't fit into simple binary categories. She was an expert in aerosols and pathogens, but the scientific community tended to see aerosols as the domain of engineers and physicists, not of scientists who study infectious diseases. It required post-binary thinking and the recognition of the post-binary quality of the way the world works to solve an issue that threatened every human being on the planet. But it took the WHO over a year to accept that this was the case, because they were so locked into binary thinking. This is a really unfortunate but perfect example of why we're at a stage where the traditional binaries we've inherited no longer feel fit for purpose. And this is especially the case following on from the pandemic, which has revealed that many binaries are rooted in overly simplistic myths about the way the world works or human nature. So this is the end of the first video in our introduction to the post-binary world. I hope you've enjoyed it and feel better informed about what the post-binary is, and in the next video we'll look at why post-binary culture is so important for brands. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you again soon.